I'm Kirsten Doubles. I'm the Assistive Technology Specialist at the Minnesota Department of Education. And another hat that I wear is the Universal Design for Learning Specialist at the department. I'm really fortunate because there is a lot of overlap between AT and UDL. One of the major differences, though, is that UDL is a general ed initiative and AT is all about special education. So kind of keep that in mind as we go through today's presentation. It's a very important distinction because our jobs as special education people is to collaborate with our general ed partners in making sure that we provide support to be able to design and implement lessons that are universally designed. So in that vein, today's session goals are to identify the 3 universal design for learning principles, the 3 learning networks, and the relationship between Common Core or state standards and the principles of UDL. So I want to talk just a little bit about the origins of UDL. Universal Design for Learning actually came out of the field of architecture where they called it universal design. And Ron Mace was the person who talked about universal design in architecture, saying, you know, why are we retrofitting all of these buildings and doing things that make buildings ugly? It solves the problem for one person. They're very costly. And so he developed, and the architecture field adopted standards that look at making things accessible from the outset, from the time that you build it or that you design a building, to make it as accessible to the widest population possible without doing any kind of retrofitting at all. That being said, CAST, or what used to be known as the Center for Applied Special Technology, decided that that was a wonderful idea for education as well. And so they took those principles of universal design and said, why are we taking these lessons and retrofitting the lessons to meet the needs of individual learners when if we design those lessons from the outset with all the kinds of supports we can, we are going to minimize the number of retrofitting activities that teachers need to do, thereby minimizing the amount of time spent adapting a lesson for one or a small group of individuals. So Universal Design for Learning came out of that to address the variability of all learners. It uses information from modern learning sciences, and we're learning more and more every day about how the brain works and how we retain information, how we gain information from our environment. And so it's using that information and in a very structured way to say these are the kinds of things that we need to do to make sure that our students have access to and can, in fact, benefit from the lessons that we are teaching. And then the third thing that Universal Design for Learning looked at was capitalizing on the advances in the flexibility of modern media technologies. Now, many people say that UDL is technology, but that is not the case. UDL can be done with zero technology. It is a way of thinking, and it is a way of putting lessons together that rely on multiple means of representation, expression, and engagement. And I'll talk about that a little more. But it's just important to remember that you can do or implement the principles of universal design for learning without having any technology in your classroom whatsoever. So the assumptions of UDL are that, and we all know this from being in classrooms, that learners in any classroom present a range of variability. There is not any one learning style, and many times we hear people talk about teaching to the average student. And what we found is that there is no average student, so we need to look at that range of variability. The goal of our instruction is to develop expert learners, to have learners want to learn for their own sake, to connect the information that we're providing in the classroom to their own lives and provide them with another way of connecting with that knowledge and expanding on it in their own lives. And then we need to know that curriculum needs to reflect the variability of those learners, and that learning is the dynamic interaction of the individual with that environment. So it depends on the environment they're in, because they may learn or they may take information in a different way depending on the environment that they're in and their interaction with the individuals or the content that is being presented. One analogy that we frequently make in Universal Design for Learning is the analogy of shoes. Most of us have shoes or wear shoes at some point or another. But if I said that everyone had to have shoes that were a size 7, for example, that would not work very well. For individuals whose feet are a size 7.5 or 8, they may be able to squeeze into a size 7 shoe and make it work. For people whose feet require a size 6 or 6.5, they may be able to stuff the shoe with something and make it work. That whole retrofitting concept of changing our lessons or retrofitting our lessons to meet the needs. But those individuals who fall outside those parameters, those shoes wouldn't be much use. In addition, we need to look at what the purpose of what we're teaching is, and do we need a special way of doing that. So for example, if you're going to be playing basketball, my high heel size 7 is not going to serve you very well. Or if you're going to go hiking, my size 7 high heel is not going to serve you very well. So we need to be aware of those kinds of things in our educational environment. It depends on what the activity is that the student will be working on, and it may be dependent on the environment itself. So we need to look at all of those kinds of things and make that variability part of our lesson planning. Now I included in here a video, but to be nice to those people who are on the phone, after testing it out, we decided we weren't going to use it, but it will be included in the wiki. There's a wiki site, and there's a link to that later in the presentation. And you can go and watch the UDL at a glance video and share it with your colleagues, because it gives a nice overview of Universal Design for Learning. As I said previously, UDL has 3 major principles, and those 3 principles are multiple means of engagement. That's the affect, or the why are we learning this, and I'm sure you might have heard this in a classroom maybe at a time or two, where someone has said, why do I need to learn this? What is this going to do for me? I'm never going to use that. So we need to look at those multiple means of engagement to engage students and connect what we're teaching to their lives. And we can do that in various ways. And I'll talk about that next week a little more when we talk about AT and UDL, and more about lesson planning in UDL. The second principle for UDL is multiple means of representation. That is the what of learning. So what is it that we're learning? How is that represented? How do we get that information? And so the second principle is that of representation, and the third is expression. That's the how of learning, sometimes called action and expression. So how do we know what our students have learned, and how do we allow them to show us what they've learned? Are we just using high-stakes testing? Are we using just pencil and paper kinds of activities? So we need to have multiple means or multiple ways for students to show us what they know or what they have learned. Here's another representation of those 3 principles. This was developed by CAST, and you'll see that in the left-hand column we have the multiple means of engagement, and then in the center we have multiple means of representation, and in the far right we have action and expression. These 3 principles can be actually put in any order. No one principle is more important than the other. However, if our students are not engaged, which is the first column on this graphic, the number of ways we provide representation probably will not matter so much because they're not engaged in the first place. And if they're not engaged in the first place, they may not have ways of showing us action and expression or showing us what they know. So these 3 principles are very important, and they can be put in any order, but we put engagement first because we know that engagement is very important, just like the other two, but in some ways it trumps the other two unless the student already knows a lot about a topic. So I'm going to talk about the recognition network first, and that's the what of learning. There's where we identify and interpret patterns of sound, light, taste, smell, and touch. So although the brain is one big integrated network, we talk about those three networks, and that's why we have the three principles of universal design. The first network, the first network I'm going to talk about, the recognition network, is actually in the back of the brain. And this network is where all of the axons that come in from your sensory organs go. So all this information that comes in from your eyes, your ears, your nose, that's where all of the information goes, is to the back of your brain. And the back of your brain is known as a big knowledge network. So as those axons race to the back of your brain, they end up in the cortex that analyzes what the patterns coming in from your eyes and ears and so on are. So that's where you can recognize what a Chevy looks like, or what coffee smells like, or what the sound of a Beethoven symphony sounds like. The whole back half of your brain is designed to process and figure out, oh, that's the coffee pattern, or oh, that's the Chevy pattern, or oh, that's the Beethoven pattern. Those patterns are difficult, and it takes a long time for your brain to learn them. And it takes the whole back half of your brain to do that process, to actually learn those different patterns. So I'm going to show you a picture for a few seconds. And I know it's grainy, but that serves its purpose. Now, I'm just going to take a second and say, think about what you saw in that picture. I'm sure, even though it was grainy and not very clear, that you were able to identify lots of objects in that picture, including people, pictures, furniture, doorways, tables, and chairs. Many of these objects are in poor light or only partially shown, but your brain could figure out what it was because you have developed the ability to recognize those different objects even in those kinds of poor lighting conditions or poor presentation conditions. I'm going to show you another picture. So what do you think this is? I'm just going to give you a second to think about it. So over the years, I've had answers such as manhole cover, opening to a tube, a ring, a frisbee, a plate, and it could be any of those. So what makes us know what this is, what helps us understand or recognize what this is? It's the context. So if we think about that in our educational settings and our educational practices, one thing that I constantly think about for students is the lowercase p, d, q, and d. And all of those, I can give those to a student in isolation, but it's the letters around those letters that help us figure out sometimes which letter it actually is, because it matters where it sits in space. So it also matters what letters are next to it. So we need to think about what we do in context. It's not just teaching things in isolation, but teaching them in context. Another example of that might be for those of us who meet someone and we know their name, we know them fairly well, and then we see them in an environment we just totally don't expect to see them in. It might take us a little while to recognize and bring back that information because it's so totally out of context. And that's an important concept that we remember as we develop or as we work on developing universally designed lessons. So when we talk about representation, the representation principle, we need to remember provide information in multiple formats, such as lecture, hands-on activities, video, demonstration, written information, apps or websites, and any other kind of representation that we can think of, because we need to provide those kinds of interactions for individuals so that they can become resourceful, knowledgeable learners. In representation, we do those multiple media and graphics, as I talked about. And then we might also want to highlight critical features and vocabulary. An activity that I used to do, I was a secondary English teacher, one of the activities we used to do was identify all the words that we could use for the word, and I don't know if you'll use this one, but couch. Couch, sofa. What else is there? Davenport. And the most we came up with was 13. But if I've never heard a particular word for that item before, I may not know what the teacher is talking about, or I may not even know what the discussion is about in that classroom. So we need to make sure that we're highlighting those critical features and vocabulary, and then activating any background knowledge and making sure that students can make those connections of, yes, that is a Buick, or yes, that is a Chevy, or yes, that is a letter P, B, D, or Q. Here are some examples of things that people have done with the multiple means of representation. One is audio text options, giving students text in an audio format. Another is balancing chemical equations using hands-on manipulatives, or on the far right-hand side of your screen, the curriculum of providing curriculum on an iPad so that students can actually put the equations in or watch videos on balancing equations. Some other kinds of representational activities would be adding a math word wall. We often see word walls in situations where people are doing writing activities or where they are involved in reading activities, but do we see them in math classrooms or science classrooms? And those word walls can be another tangible representation for people. Another option, in Minnesota we have what we call learning trunks, which we can check out from the Children's Museum, and that way students, for example, can touch things from history and understand different kinds of things that they may not have access to in their home community or classroom. And then one of the favorites for our younger kids is the tangible timeline, understanding time, but putting together a tangible timeline. So how long is 100 years? We put 100 sticky notes together, and then they can see how far that is between point A and point B on a timeline. Multiple means of representation is quite important. The second principle of universal design for learning that I'm going to talk about is the strategic network. This is the how of learning. This is where we plan, execute, and monitor actions and skills. And the strategic network is in the front half of our brain. And the strategic part of our brain has a very different anatomy and a very different function. The primary feature of the strategic network is that the axons leave your brain and go out to the muscles. And the front part of your brain allows you to move, to do skillful things like dance or shoot baskets, and to make plans for action so that you plan to go to the store and you figure out the route and everything involved with that. So the front part of your brain does that for you. It's strategic in that it gives you not only the actions, but the plan for actions. So I'm showing you this picture again because I'm going to skip over it here because I just want to talk a little bit about the picture, in that if you know why you're looking at a picture, you may have different strategies for understanding what a picture is about. Or if you have instructions about what a lesson is about, it might give you some information about what might be the most important or critical features that you want to focus on. So in this picture, I'm using this graphic because they did some eye gaze studies. And in the graphic on the upper right-hand side of this picture, the individuals were asked, what kind of a room is this? And so as they look around, you can see that people are looking at different things, gazing at different parts of that picture. In the lower left-hand corner, they asked, what are the material circumstances of this family? And so again, they're looking at some very specific things in the environment to answer that question. And in picture 3, which is the lower right-hand graphic on this particular slide, you can see that the eye gaze is specifically on the faces of the people. And they ask, what are the ages of the individuals? So if we know what we're looking for, we're going to have very specific strategies developed, or very specific strategies that we follow to try and identify those pieces of information. Thinking about that in education and in our classrooms, this is why we might want to preview a lesson, tell the students what the goal of the lesson is and what they are looking for, so that they can then develop those strategies and follow those strategies to gain information from the information provided by the teacher. So action and expression, we want to provide students with the goal of the lesson, provide options for students to show what they know, and provide models, feedback, and support for different levels of proficiency. We want to develop those strategic, goal-oriented learners, or sometimes in UDL, we say that we as educators want to be the guide on the side and not the sage on the stage. Some action and expression examples would include the National Library of Virtual Manipulatives, which has a library of things that you can have students do with counting sticks and things of that nature, but it's all virtual and they are accessible. So that's one way of having action and expression. We can have students video record their oral responses to questions that we have, or in the center on this slide we have EduCreations app, which is an app that will allow students to have multiple ways of inputting information, whether they draw a picture, type an answer, or give an oral answer that is recorded in the application. And the third or the fourth one on the right-hand side, Equivalent Fractions Hopscotch, which gives people action and expression that involves their whole body. So some different types of ways of showing what a student has learned about a particular lesson. On this slide we have video practice up in the upper left-hand corner. This was an activity where students practiced their lesson for their peers, and they practiced over and over, and they would videotape their lesson. They were asked to teach a lesson to their peers, and they would videotape that lesson over and over and over, and then they could critique themselves and improve their own learning and improve their lesson skills to teach their peers. Personalized practice is in the center, and that's where students are working at their own pace using, in this case, tablet technology to learn a particular skill. And then on the right, we're involving students as leaders by having them teach or teach each other a particular lesson or activity. The third network, which is the final network we're going to talk about, is the Affective Network. And the Affective Network is the why of learning. It was the first one I talked about in the graphic, but I have it as number 3 here. And this is where we evaluate our priorities. In the Affective Network, that all has to do with emotion and what things make us fearful or what things make us excited, what things appear novel to us and are exciting. Its function is not to recognize patterns or to generate patterns of activity, but to evaluate patterns, to identify what's important to the whole brain network and what should be focused on. What's the kind of action that's the most important to take? So that's where we're setting those priorities and identifying what should we do now? What is the important thing that we're supposed to do at this point in time? And again, a picture that you've already seen. I'm going to have you just take a second and think about a story related to this picture. So think about what grabbed your attention. When I do this activity in a situation where I might have a little more time, I might have the participants speak with their table partner or talk about it in a small group, or just think about their yell out a story in a large group situation about what that picture is about. I've had everything on that picture, everything from this is a gentleman coming home after war bringing flowers to his wife, to this is a domestic situation and everyone is fearful in this environment. The difference between the storytellers was that the person who told the story about this being a person who was coming home from the war and bringing flowers to his wife had a family member who had just returned from active duty, and that was uppermost in her mind. The person who talked about this being a domestic abuse situation talked about it because they had heard a story about domestic abuse on the radio on their way to the training that morning, and that was uppermost in their mind. So sometimes it's about what the students come to us with in their mind at the time we're trying to teach them lessons. So as we're giving them information, they're going to filter that and think about that from their own perspective and what is most affecting them at that particular point in time. So even though it might be very clear to us that I'm asking a student to do something, they may not see it that way because they're interpreting that information in a totally different way. So engagement is all about firing up kids, getting them excited about education. And we know that what excites one student will not necessarily excite another. But if we give students choices to fuel their interests and autonomy, that they're going to be more engaged in lessons, and that if students love learning, they will persist through challenges. And there have been quite a few studies that talk about persisting through challenges, and they call it grit. So if we give students the tools, we give them the information that fires them up and gets them engaged, that they will persist through those challenges and become those purposeful, motivated learners that we want to see. For the engagement, some examples that we have here are recording reading fluency and feedback, where individuals are recording their fluency, and then they can hear themselves whether they have fluency issues or if they're reading at a particular rate or correct pronunciation. So they are able to gauge that themselves. Tumble Books is an example. And then on the lower right-hand side, we have Adjust Pace and Energy to hook students. So where students can engage in an activity at their level where they think they're at. So they are choosing where they need more practice or what they need to do. Some additional engagement activities on the upper upper left-hand corner is the graphing of sign. So in the first picture there, they're doing a dance of what sign looks like. And then the next picture of the gentleman holding the drawing, that is what sign looks like in a drawn format. So we have two individuals depicting the same thing in two different ways. And those are very disparate ways of showing what that is, but both of them are accurate in their depiction. Then we have on the lower left-hand side, we have choice boards, excuse me, and where students can choose how they want to show what they know. And on the lower right, atomic tic-tac-toe. And so that's another game. It's showing how they know and giving them that activity. And then on the upper right-hand corner, a child playing with dice, using the choice and showing adding and subtracting with the dice. And again, that's how we make those purposeful, motivated learners. So if we have engagement and we have good representation or multiple representation and multiple actions and expressions, we can have or reach most learners without having to do that retrofitting that is taking so much time from our day. We still may have incidents where we need to provide that one-to-one training or activity or modification, but by creating our lessons in a more universally designed way, it reduces the amount of individual change we need to make. So when we talk about universal design for learning, and I talk about it as the universal design for learning umbrella, it encompasses many of the initiatives that we're asked to implement in our school buildings. And next week I'll talk a little bit more about those three principles and how we can actually find tools and resources that we can use to embed those multiple means of action, expression, and engagement into our lessons. But we look at those standards-based teaching and learning, academic standards of whatever type, and UDL can help us create lessons that are based on our academic standards by providing those multiple means of action, expression, and engagement. We can evaluate teachers based on those principles and all those multi-tiered systems of support that are out there to accelerate learning for individuals is incorporated into the principles of universal design for learning under those 3 principles. So I typically talk about that UDL umbrella. In many situations we don't, some of the schools in Minnesota don't talk about UDL, they just say here's a framework for implementing all of these initiatives that you have so that people don't hear another set of letters and get scared. But once we talk about it as that umbrella or that framework that can incorporate all of our initiatives, people are much more on board. When we talk about standards, there are 2 types of standards that I'm sure you're aware of. Content standards, that's, this information that we want to share with our students, whether it be, photosynthesis or something else. And then the method standards, which are specific skills students will have to complete to be successful. And the key to their success on those method standards is following a process. And so when we talk about those 2, we want to remind us that for those knowledge standards, that students have options for how they learn, choices in how they will engage in their interests and challenge them, and choices for how they demonstrate their learning. And the teacher will provide those flexible ways of presenting the lesson content. Like, again, that's that multiple means of representation, flexible options for student engagement, and flexible methods of expression and assessment. For those process standards, students will have to complete a task in a specific way, but teachers will provide flexible ways of presenting lessons again, but will also provide scaffolding and work samples for each step of the process, and graphic organizers, rubrics, collaboration, and opportunities to provide mastery-oriented feedback for whatever that process is. So students will be able to select on the rubric where they think they are, where they think they need more work, and then they can get more tools and resources or more interaction with a teacher or collaboration with a peer on learning or developing that skill. Again, universal design for learning has those 3 primary brain networks. We have the recognition, supported by multiple means of representation, the strategic, supported by multiple means of expression, and affective network, supported by multiple means of engagement. And that is UDL in a very short nutshell.